The silence was the first sign. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, but a hollow, structural silence, the kind that follows the removal of a load-bearing wall. Elias stood in the entryway, his steel-toed boots leaving faint prints of dust on the polished floorboards he had laid himself. The air was still and smelled of nothing, which was wrong. It should have smelled of Clara's perfume, a floral scent that clung to the air like a ghost or the remnants of the dinner she was supposed to have been making. Instead, there was only the clean, sterile scent of lemon polish and the cold, mineral tang of the approaching night. He moved through the house with the methodical slowness of a man inspecting a site for flaws. His gaze swept over the living room, cataloguing the subtle disturbances. The cushions on the sofa were too perfectly plumped. A stack of magazines, usually fanned out in a casual arc, was squared off with geometric precision. These were the signs of a departure, not a life being lived. It was the tidiness of a crime scene after the body has been removed. His heart, a heavy and reliable machine in his chest, began to misfire, a slow, grinding beat that echoed the dread coiling in his stomach. In the kitchen the silence was louder still. The stainless steel appliances reflected a distorted version of him, a broad-shouldered man in a dusty work shirt, his face smudged with the day's labor, his expression unreadable even to himself. On the granite island, a place usually cluttered with mail and keys and the ephemera of their shared life, sat a single white envelope. Next to it, catching the last of the evening light, lay her wedding ring. It was a perfect, vicious circle of gold, a tiny monument to a colossal failure. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine white lines of 100 small cuts and healed burns, felt clumsy and foreign as he reached for the envelope. The paper was crisp, expensive. Her handwriting, a series of elegant, forward-leaning loops, was as beautiful and as cold as ever. He did not need to read it. He knew the architecture of betrayal. He could see the blueprints of it in the stark emptiness of the room, in the glint of the abandoned ring. He read it anyway. Elias, it began, with no warmth, no preamble. I can't do this anymore. This life, this struggle. It isn't what I wanted. Julian can give me the things we only ever talked about. I've gone with him. My things are gone. The lawyer will be in touch about the rest. There was no apology, only a statement of fact, as brutal and unadorned as a block of poured concrete. But there was more. A postscript, a final twist of the knife. Maya is in her room. Her school called again. She got into another fight. I can't handle her. You've always been better with her anyway. She's your problem now. The weight of those last words landed on him with physical force, driving the air from his lungs. Maya. Her 17-year-old sister. A girl balanced on the knife's edge of adolescence, all anger and hurt, who had been living with them for the past year after their mother had passed. Clara had taken her in as a duty. Elias had cared for her as family. And now she too was a piece of debris left in the wreckage. He dropped the letter, the paper fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. He looked at his hands, at the dirt ground deep into the creases of his knuckles. He had built this house with these hands. He had repaired its foundation, framed its walls, laid its floors. He had done it for her, for the life he thought they were building together. He had believed their foundation was solid, built on years of shared history and whispered promises. He saw now that he had been building on sand. The structure had been a facade, and the first strong wind had brought it all down. A sound from upstairs, the soft click of a door. Maya, the secondary burden, the immediate responsibility. The anger that had been a low spark in his gut now flared, hot and useless. She had not only deserted him, she had abandoned her own blood, leaving him to manage the fallout. He was a builder, a man who understood stress points and load capacities. He could feel his own internal structure groaning under a weight it was never designed to bear. The house was silent again, but now it was the silence of a tomb. He was buried alive in the life he had built. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. The days that followed were a blur of dust and noise and numbness. At work, the clamour of nail guns and the roar of heavy machinery were a welcome anesthetic, drowning out the cacophony in his own head. He threw himself into the physical labour, welcoming the exhaustion that settled deep in his bones each night. It was a clean, honest pain, a feeling he could understand. He would work until his muscles screamed, until the sweat stung his eyes and washed away the grime of the day, hoping it could also wash away the stain of Clara's departure. But it never did. The moment he stepped back into the hollow quiet of the house, the silence would rush in to fill the void, and the ache would return, deeper and more profound than any physical strain. The house itself had become a hostile environment. Every object was a memory, every empty space a testament to his loss. The indentation on the mattress where she used to sleep, the scent of her shampoo lingering in a bottle in the shower, the single coffee mug left in the cupboard next to his. He operated on autopilot, a ghost in his own home, moving through a life that no longer felt like his. Meals were eaten standing up, snatched from the refrigerator without thought to taste or texture. Laundry piled up, a mountain of work clothes and Maya's discarded teenage outfits. The careful order Clara had maintained crumbled into a bachelor's chaos, a physical manifestation of his internal disarray. Maya was a storm cloud moving through the house, all silent fury and slammed doors. She rarely spoke to him, her grief and anger at her sister's abandonment a palpable force field around her. He would find her staring out the window, her expression a mixture of defiance and a vulnerability so raw it hurt to look at. He tried to reach her, making clumsy attempts at conversation, cooking meals she would barely touch. He was a man who knew how to build things from wood and steel, but he had no blueprint for rebuilding a shattered teenage girl. His words felt like ill-fitting tools, clumsy and ineffective. He was failing her just as he had failed to see the cracks forming in his own marriage. The thought was a constant, grinding weight. His boss, Marcus, a man whose face was a roadmap of deadlines met and storms weathered, watched him with a shrewd, unsympathetic eye. Elias's work, usually meticulous, had become sloppy. He was late twice in 1 week, his mind a fog of sleepless nights and anxious thoughts. He missed a measurement on a frame, forcing an entire crew to redo a morning's work. Marcus cornered him by the stacks of lumber, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. "Your head's not in the game, Elias," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. "Whatever's going on at home, you leave it there. This site is no place for ghosts. One more mistake like that, and you're off the crew. Understand?" Elias just nodded, the shame a hot flush on his neck. He couldn't explain, he couldn't give voice to the failure that was consuming him. So he just worked harder, pushing his body past its limits, hoping the physical toll would somehow atone for his mental absence. But he was running on empty, the engine of his will sputtering and threatening to seize. The breaking point came not from a grand disaster, but from a small, mundane failure. It was a Tuesday night, the rain outside a relentless, drumming assault on the roof. He had spent an hour trying to fix a leak in the sink, his knuckles raw and bleeding from a slipped wrench. The pipe, old and corroded, refused to yield. Water dripped with infuriating persistence into the bucket below. At the same time, he was trying to help Maya with her algebra homework, a subject he hadn't touched in 20 years. The variables and equations swam before his eyes, a meaningless jumble of symbols that felt like another language he couldn't speak.
"I don't get it," Maya muttered, her voice thick with frustration, pushing the textbook away. "It's stupid. I'm stupid." "No, you're not," Elias said, his own patience worn thin. "Let's just look at it again." "Why? You don't get it either," she shot back, her eyes flashing with a familiar, defensive anger. "Just leave me alone." She stood up, knocking her chair over, and stormed out of the room. The sound of her bedroom door slamming shut was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He was left alone in the kitchen, the textbook open to a chapter on quadratic equations, the faucet dripping its maddening rhythm, the rain hammering down. He looked at the leaking pipe, a simple problem of pressure and decay that he, a builder, a man who wrangled foundations and rooflines for a living, could not fix. He looked at the incomprehensible math, a symbol of the vast, unbridgeable distance between him and the angry, grieving girl in the other room. He was failing at everything. He was a bad husband, a bad worker, a bad guardian. Something inside him, a tightly wound spring of pride and stoicism and sheer grit that had held him together for weeks, snapped. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, guttural sob that was torn from the deepest part of him. It was the sound of a structure collapsing under its own weight. He slid down the kitchen cabinets, his back scraping against the wood, and landed heavily on the floor. The cold of the linoleum seeped through his jeans. He put his head in his hands, the rough texture of his palms scraping against his face, and for the first time since she had left, he wept. It was not a quiet, dignified grief, but a storm of racking, desperate sobs that shook his entire body. He was at the bottom, surrounded by the rubble of his life, with no idea how to even begin to clear it away. He did not know how long he sat there on the cold kitchen floor, a broken man in a broken house. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a tiny hammer against the roof. The faucet dripped its steady, mocking time. The world outside his small circle of misery continued, indifferent to his collapse. He felt a profound, bottomless despair, the kind that whispers that there is no point in getting up, that the rubble is where you belong. He was adrift, his anchors cut, with no shoreline in sight. The man who built things had been unbuilt, dismantled, piece by painful piece, until only the raw, splintered frame of him remained. A soft sound pulled him from the depths, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. He looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and saw Maya standing in the doorway. Her usual mask of teenage defiance was gone, replaced by an expression of wide-eyed shock and something else, fear. She had never seen him like this. He was her rock, the quiet, steady presence that had, for the past year, been the only constant in her chaotic world, and her rock was crumbling. She hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly into the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She just knelt on the floor beside him, her movements awkward and uncertain. She reached out a tentative hand and placed it on his shaking shoulder. It was a small gesture, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their shared and separate griefs. Her touch was light, but it felt like a lifeline. He took a shuddering breath, trying to regain control. He looked at her, at this girl who had lost her mother, and then been abandoned by her sister, left in the care of a man who was now falling apart before her eyes. The sight of her, her face, pale with worry, was a shock to his system, a jolt of ice water that cut through the fog of his self-pity. This wasn't just about him, it was about her, She was relying on him. Sinking was not an option. It was a luxury he could not afford. The decision was not a conscious thought, not a reasoned argument. It was a primal, instinctual shift, a reignition of a pilot light he thought had been extinguished. He would not let Clara's desertion destroy 2 lives. He would not let Maya become another piece of collateral damage. He would stop sinking. He would start building. He did not know how. He did not know with what. But in that moment, kneeling on the floor of his ruined kitchen with a frightened girl's hand on his shoulder, he made a silent, binding contract with himself. The demolition was over. It was time for construction to begin. He slowly, achingly pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt unsteady, but they held. He looked at the leaking sink, then at Maya. "Let's fix this," he said, his voice hoarse. It was the first step, a small, concrete action in a world that had become terrifyingly abstract. He would start with the leak. Then he would figure out the rest. He would build a new life for them, a stronger one, with a foundation that no storm could wash away. The first step required a sacrifice. The foundation for his new life needed capital, something he had precious little of. His savings had been drained by the down payment on the house, their house, and the endless small expenses that came with it. Clara had been the one who managed their finances, a fact he now saw with blinding, painful clarity as a strategic error. The lawyer she had mentioned in her letter had indeed been in touch with a list of demands that felt like a second wave of assault. She wanted half of everything, including the equity in the house he had poured his own sweat into. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one for his own survival and one against the ghost of his former life. He spent a week cataloguing his assets, the meager sum of his existence. There wasn't much: his tools, his work truck, and one other thing. It sat in the garage under a dusty tarp, a relic from another lifetime. It was his father's 1972 Ford F-100. It was a beast of a machine, sea-foam green with patches of primer where the rust had been treated. His father had taught him how to drive in that truck, how to change the oil, how to read the language of an engine. It was the only significant thing his father had left him, a tangible piece of the man who had taught him the value of hard work and the quiet dignity of building something with your own hands. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb, but sentiment was a luxury. Maya's future, his future, was not. He spent a weekend cleaning it, polishing the chrome until it gleamed, tuning the engine until it hummed with a deep, resonant power. Each turn of the wrench was a pang of grief, a letting go of a piece of his past. Maya watched him from the doorway of the garage, silent and observant. She understood what he was doing. She knew the stories he had told her about his father and that truck. She didn't say anything, but her presence was a quiet acknowledgement of the sacrifice. When the buyer came, a collector, with an appreciative eye for classic American steel, Elias didn't haggle. He took the man's offer, a respectable sum that felt both like a fortune and like blood money. He watched the truck drive away until its taillights disappeared around the corner, a final fading ember of his old life. The money sat in his bank account, a heavy, potent sum. It was not enough to start a company, but it was enough for a different kind of tool. He enrolled in a night course at the local community college, construction management and architectural drafting. He knew how to build, but he didn't know the language of the men who designed the buildings. He didn't understand the complex dance of logistics, bidding, and contracts that happened in the site trailer while he was out in the mud and the rain. He needed to learn that language. He needed to move from the hammer to the blueprint. The classroom felt alien. The air smelled of chalk dust and floor wax, a stark contrast to the familiar sense of sawdust and diesel. He was older than most of the other students, his hands marked with a history of physical labor that theirs were not. He felt out of place, a rough-hewn beam in a room of polished marble. His instructor was a woman named Lena. She was sharp, precise, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She moved with an architect's economy of motion and spoke with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. Their initial interactions were purely professional, tinged with a hint of what felt like her skepticism. He was a construction worker, a grunt, in her world of elegant designs and complex theories. He could feel her watching him, judging his rough sketches, his fumbling attempts to master the drafting software. He saw the way her eyes lingered on his calloused hands as he struggled with the delicate mouse. He was determined to prove her, and himself, wrong. He poured every ounce of his remaining energy into the course. After a 10-hour day on the job site, he would eat a hurried dinner with Maya, help her with her homework. They were tackling algebra together now, a team against the tyranny of X, and then drive to the college. He would sit in the fluorescent hum of the classroom, his body aching, and force his tired mind to absorb theories of structural integrity, building codes, and site planning. He would stay late in the computer lab, practicing on the drafting software until the lines on the screen were as clean and confident as the ones he could snap with a chalk line on a subfloor. One evening, Lena stopped by his workstation. He was engrossed in a project, a design for a small residential home. He had been working on it for hours, refining the layout, thinking about the flow of light, the placement of load-bearing walls, the practical realities of construction that the other students, with their purely academic knowledge, often overlooked. "You're still here, Mr. Vance?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Just finishing up," he replied, not looking up from the screen. She was silent for a long moment, studying his design over his shoulder. He could feel her presence, a quiet intensity that made him acutely aware of the sawdust still in his hair and the smudge of grease on his cheek. "Your sense of space is good," she said finally. "And your understanding of materials is practical." He wasn't sure if it was a compliment. "I've been on the other side of the drawings," he said. "I know what works and what's a nightmare to actually build." "Most architects forget that," she admitted. "They design for the portfolio, not for the people who have to live in the space or the people who have to build it." She pointed to a section of his design. "This transition here from the living area to the kitchen, it's unconventional, but it creates a natural flow." "Why did you do it that way?" He explained his reasoning, talking about sight lines, about how a family would move through the space, about the way the morning sun would hit the breakfast nook. He spoke with a quiet passion he hadn't realized he possessed. He wasn't just connecting lines on a screen, he was imagining a home. He was building something in his mind. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of something new in her expression. The professional distance was still there, but it was joined by a glimmer of respect. She saw past the calloused hands and the tired eyes. She saw the builder, not just a builder of walls, but a builder of ideas. "You have a good eye, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Don't waste it." She walked away, leaving him alone in the quiet lab. Her words echoed in the silence. Don't waste it. It was more than encouragement. It was a challenge. It was the first time in months that someone had looked at him and seen potential instead of pity. It was a single, well-placed timber, shoring up a collapsing wall within him. He turned back to the screen, his resolve hardening like quickset concrete. He had laid the first part of his new foundation. It was small, it was rough, but it was solid. And he would build on it, one course, one project, one grueling day at a time.
The grind had begun. The next 5 years were a montage of relentless forward motion, a time-lapse film of a life being systematically deconstructed and rebuilt from the ground up. The passage of time was marked not by seasons but by milestones of exhaustion and achievement. Elias lived a dual existence. By day, he was a body on Marcus's construction site, his muscles burning, his skin weathered by sun and wind. By night, he was a mind in a classroom, absorbing the abstract principles of design and management, his brain aching with a different kind of fatigue. Sleep was a rationed commodity, a brief, dreamless darkness between two worlds. He finished the certificate program, then immediately enrolled in another, this time in business administration. The money from his father's truck was long gone, spent on tuition and books, and the ever-present stack of bills. He took on side jobs, weekend kitchen remodels, deck installations, fence repairs. He worked with a fierce, single-minded focus that left little room for anything else. He was a machine fueled by coffee and a burning need to prove something, though to whom he was no longer certain. The initial fire of anger towards Clara had cooled into a hard, dense core of ambition. His revenge would not be an emotional outburst, but the slow, deliberate construction of a life so solid, so successful, that her memory would be nothing more than a footnote in its architectural plans. At Marcus's company, the change in him was gradual but undeniable. He began to see the job site not just as a place of physical labor, but as a complex system of logistics, timelines, and human dynamics. He anticipated problems before they happened. He found efficiencies the foreman missed. He spoke up in meetings, his voice quiet but confident, offering practical solutions rooted in his years of hands-on experience. Marcus, who valued competence above all else, started to notice. The gruff dismissiveness in his eyes was slowly replaced by a grudging respect. Elias was promoted to foreman, then to site supervisor. He traded his tool belt for a clipboard, his hammer for a set of rolled-up blueprints. His hands, though still strong, began to lose their permanent layer of grime. His relationship with Lena evolved with the same slow, deliberate pace. After he completed her course, she had offered him some freelance drafting work, small projects for an architectural firm she worked for. Their late-night sessions in the college computer lab transitioned to late-night meetings at a diner, hunched over schematics and coffee. She was a demanding collaborator, pushing him, challenging his assumptions, forcing him to defend his design choices. But she was also his most ardent supporter. She saw the architect inside the builder, and she helped him draw it out. Their partnership was forged in the shared language of their profession. They spoke of load paths and zoning variances, of the beauty of a well-designed joint and the integrity of honest materials. But beneath the technical talk, something else was being built, a foundation of mutual respect, of shared ambition, of a quiet understanding that went deeper than words. He found himself admiring not just her brilliant mind, but the fierce loyalty she showed to her work and to the few people she let into her life. He saw the warmth beneath her professional exterior, the way her eyes would soften when he spoke of Maya. Maya, in these years, had undergone her own transformation. With the storm of Clara's departure having passed, and with the steady, quiet presence of Elias as her anchor, she had begun to find her footing. The anger that had once defined her slowly receded, revealing a smart, resilient young woman. They had navigated the treacherous terrain of her teenage years together, a clumsy but effective team. He attended her parent-teacher conferences, cheered her on at her soccer games, and helped her with her college applications. He had become, in every way that mattered, her father. The night she was accepted into a prestigious engineering program, they celebrated with a pizza on the living room floor, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, a simple gesture of affection and trust
that filled the hollow spaces in his heart more than any professional success ever could. The house, once a tomb, was now a home. Elias started his own small venture on the side, a move born of necessity and Lena's encouragement. He used his savings to buy a small, dilapidated house in a forgotten neighborhood, a property no one else wanted. He spent his weekends and evenings gutting it, rebuilding it with his own hands, applying the design principles he had learned. Lena would often come by with coffee, offering advice on the layout or helping him choose fixtures. When it was finished, he sold it for a modest profit. He immediately reinvested the money into 2 more properties. His company, which he named Vance Foundations, was born. It was during this period that he stumbled upon an opportunity. He learned through a contact that the mortgages on several homes in a particular neighborhood were in distress, owned by a family that had fallen on hard times after the patriarch had lost his job. The bank was preparing to foreclose. The family name was Peterson. Clara's family. Her parents' house, her brother's house. A cold, clear thought materialized in his mind, fully formed and chillingly precise. It was a strategic impulse devoid of emotion. It was a move in a long game he hadn't even consciously known he was playing. Through a series of carefully constructed LLCs, a legal maze designed by a lawyer Lena had recommended, he bought the debt. He became the anonymous lien holder on their future. He instructed the management company to lower their payments to a manageable level, an act that looked like mercy but was, in fact, the setting of a trap. He wanted them stable. He wanted them dependent on the quiet, unknown benevolence of their creditor. He filed the paperwork away and did not think of it again. It was a dormant weapon, a structural failsafe built into the framework of his new life. 7 years after Clara had walked out, Elias was a different man. The naivete was gone, burned away by betrayal, and forged into something harder in the crucible of his relentless work. He was no longer just a builder, he was an architect of his own destiny. Vance Foundations was now a respected development firm, known for its quality craftsmanship and innovative designs. He had a partnership with Marcus, who was easing into semi-retirement, and had entrusted Elias with the future of the company they had merged. He and Lena were partners in every sense of the word, their personal and professional lives seamlessly intertwined. They lived in a house he had designed and built, a structure of glass and cedar and steel that felt like a physical manifestation of their shared vision. He was standing on the balcony of that house, looking out over the city lights, Lena's hand resting on his arm, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Elias, it's me. Clara, I'm back in town. We need to talk." He looked at the message, at the name that was now a relic from a distant past. He felt no anger, no pain. He felt only a quiet, cold sense of inevitability. The ghost had returned, but this time he knew the house he had built was strong enough to withstand any storm. She appeared at his office a week later, unannounced. The receptionist, a young, efficient woman who had only ever known him as Mr. Vance, the calm, decisive head of the company, buzzed his private line. "There's a woman here named Clara," she said, a note of uncertainty in her voice. "She says she's your wife." Elias felt a moment of stillness, the quiet intake of breath before a controlled demolition. "Send her in," he said, his voice even. He stood up from behind his large oak desk, a piece of furniture he had built himself, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. The view was expansive, a testament to how far he had come. He could see 2 skyscrapers in the distance that his company had helped build. He heard the door open and close behind him. "Elias," she said. Her voice was different, stripped of the confident, careless tone he remembered. It was thinner, laced with a manufactured vulnerability. He turned around slowly. The 7 years had not been as kind to her as they had been to him. The expensive clothes she wore looked tired, the designer handbag a little worn at the corners. There were fine lines of stress around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. The effortless glow of entitlement had been replaced by the faint, desperate sheen of a performer. She was playing a role, and she was not a very good actress. "Clara," he acknowledged, his tone neutral. He did not invite her to sit. He remained standing, creating a clear geography of power in the room. He was behind his desk, in his office, in his world. She was an intruder. "You've done well for yourself," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the custom furniture, the original architectural drawings on the walls, the view. There was a flicker of avarice in her gaze, quickly masked by a sorrowful smile. "I always knew you had it in you." It was a clumsy, transparent attempt to rewrite history, to claim some small credit for the empire he had built on the ashes of the life she had destroyed. He did not indulge her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice calm and direct. Her performance began in earnest. Tears welled in her eyes, perfectly timed, catching the light from the window. "I made a terrible mistake, Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was a fool, young, stupid, dazzled by things that don't matter." She took a step closer. "Julian, it all fell apart. It was all a lie. The money, everything, he's gone. I have nothing." She painted a picture of victimhood, of a woman led astray by a charismatic charlatan, a prodigal wife returning home for forgiveness. She spoke of their past, of shared memories he had long since walled off, trying to find a crack in his armor, a sentimental foothold she could use to climb back into his life. He listened without expression, his face an impassive mask. He was like a structural engineer examining a building for weaknesses, and he could find none. The man she was appealing to, the naive, overly trusting man who would have been swayed by her tears, no longer existed. He had been demolished years ago. "I've thought about you every day," she continued, her voice dropping to an intimate murmur. "About us, what we had. It was real, wasn't it? We were happy." "We were," he agreed, the single word a cold, hard fact, not an invitation for reminiscence. "And then we weren't." His lack of emotional response seemed to rattle her. Her performance faltered. The tears dried up, replaced by a flicker of the old, familiar frustration, the annoyance of a woman who was not getting what she wanted. "I see," she said, her tone hardening slightly. "You've built these walls around yourself, and you have someone else, I hear." "Lena is my partner," he said, the word carrying a weight and a meaning Clara could never comprehend. "And Maya?" she asked, a new tactic. "How is she?" "I'm her sister, Elias. I have a right to see her." "Maya is a sophomore at one of the best engineering schools in the country," he stated flatly. "She is happy. She's thriving. You gave up your rights to her 7 years ago." The mention of Maya's success, a life flourishing in her absence, seemed to sting. This was not going according to her script. The pity plea had failed. Her face tightened, the mask of remorse slipping to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. "I see how it is," she said, her voice turning sharp and ugly. "You've got your perfect new life, your new family, and you want to just erase me. But you can't, Elias. We're still married." He remained silent, letting her play her hand. "I looked it up," she said, a triumphant, venomous glint in her eye. "The divorce papers were never finalized. Your lawyer sent them, but my lawyer at the time, well, things with Julian were moving so fast, it got overlooked." Legally, Elias, you and I are still husband and wife. And that means half of all this, she gestured around the office, at the city beyond the window, half of this perfect little empire you've built is mine. It was her trump card, her hidden ace, the threat of a protracted, ugly legal battle, of dragging him through the mud, of tearing apart the life he had so meticulously constructed. She smiled, a cold, predatory curving of her lips. She thought she had him. She thought she had found the structural weakness, the single point of failure that would bring the whole thing crashing down. She had mistaken his silence for weakness, his calm for fear. It was the same mistake she had made 7 years ago. He didn't react.
He simply walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a single, thin file folder. He placed it on the polished surface of the desk between them. "Our divorce was finalized 7 years ago, Clara," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of anger. "The final decree was entered on October 12th. Your lawyer, who you were paying with Julian's money, was disbarred 3 years ago for embezzlement, which is probably why you never received your copy, but the court has one. And I have one right here." He pushed the folder towards her. She stared at it, her triumphant expression crumbling into confusion and disbelief. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew from the quiet finality in his voice that he was telling the truth. Her leverage, the foundation of her entire desperate plan, had just turned to dust. Her face contorted with a sudden, raw fury. The last vestiges of her performance burned away, leaving only the ugly, grasping desperation that had driven her to his door. "You think you're so clever," she hissed. "You can't just cut me out. I'll fight you. I'll tell everyone what you did. I'll go to Maya. I'll tell her how you kept her from me, poisoned her against her own family." "Her family?" Elias asked, and for the first time a trace of ice entered his voice. "You mean the family that was about to be homeless 5 years ago?" Clara froze, her tirade cut short. A look of genuine confusion crossed her face. "What are you talking about?" "Your parents," Elias said, his voice a low, steady demolition hammer, striking one blow after another. "Your brother. Their mortgages. After your father lost his job at the plant, they defaulted. The bank was going to foreclose. They were going to lose everything, the houses they've lived in their whole lives." He let the words hang in the air. He watched the dawning horror in her eyes as she began to understand. She had come here assuming she had a safety net, a family to fall back on, to manipulate, to use as a base of operations for her assault on him. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a second, thicker file. He opened it and spread the documents across the polished wood. They were legal deeds, mortgage assignments, records of payment, all bearing the name of a holding company she wouldn't recognize. "A private investment group bought their debt from the bank," he explained calmly, methodically. "A very generous group. They restructured the loans, lowered the payments. They've allowed your family to live in their homes for the past 5 years, paying a fraction of what they should have been. Your family, Clara, your entire safety net." He picked up the top sheet, a document that gave him power of attorney over the holding company. He held it up for her to see. "I own that investment group," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a wrecking ball. "I own their houses. I own your parents' house. I own your brother's house. I have been their silent, unknown landlord for 62 months. The colour drained from her face. She stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, the full, crushing weight of his revelation settling upon her. She had come to his office to threaten his empire, only to discover that he had owned her entire world all along,
Every letter she had received from home, every phone call where her mother had talked about the miracle of the anonymous investors who had saved them, had been a part of his long, silent, patient strategy. The mercy he had shown her family was not an act of kindness. It was the careful placement of a charge, waiting for the right moment to be detonated. You can't," she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. "I can," he said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. It was not triumph, it was not anger, it was simply the statement of a fact, as simple and as brutal as the note she had left on the kitchen counter. "You came here to threaten me, to threaten my family, to try and take what I have built. You have nothing to threaten me with, but I," he paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, "I can have your entire family on the street by the end of the month with a single phone call." He watched the last bit of fight drain out of her. He watched the arrogant, manipulative woman dissolve, leaving behind something small, broken, and utterly defeated. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time, not as the simple, hard-working man she had left behind, but as a formidable, strategic power she could not hope to match. He had played a game she hadn't even known existed, and he had won it before she ever sat down at the table. "Get out," he said. The words were not shouted. They were a quiet, final command. "Get out of my office, get out of my city, and if you ever try to contact me or Lena or Maya again, you will discover just how solid the foundations I build really are." She stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with a fear that was finally, completely genuine. She turned and fled from the room, a ghost exorcised by the stark, undeniable truth. The door clicked shut behind her, and the office was silent once more. Elias stood there for a long moment, the legal documents spread across his desk like the spoils of a war he had never wanted to fight. He felt no elation, no savage joy in his victory. He felt only a profound sense of lightness, as if a massive, unseen weight he had been carrying for 7 years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He had not done it for revenge, he realized. He had done it for peace. He had built a fortress around his new life, and the final gate had just been closed and barred. The past was now, officially, a foreign country to which he would never return. He walked over to the thick file and closed it. He did not need to look at it again. He would call the management company later and instruct them to transfer the deeds to his in-laws, free and clear, a final, anonymous act that would sever the last tie. He picked up his phone and dialed Lena. She answered on the first ring. "It's over," he said, the words simple and complete. "I know," she replied, her voice warm and steady, a comforting presence even through the phone. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said, and he was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. The last of the rubble had been cleared. "I'll be home soon." That evening he drove home, not to the hollow silence of the past, but to a house filled with light and warmth and the sound of laughter. Lena was in the kitchen, and Maya, home for the weekend, was sitting at the counter telling a story about one of her professors. The air smelled of roasting garlic and something sweet baking in the oven. It was the smell of a life being lived, of a home that was truly a home. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. Lena looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. Maya hopped off the stool and hugged him, a fierce, strong embrace. "Hey," she said, "you're just in time. We're trying to figure out the optimal stress distribution for this cheesecake." He laughed, a real, unburdened sound. He looked at these two women, his partner, and the daughter he had raised, the twin pillars of his new life. This was his empire. It wasn't the buildings, the money, or the company. It was this love, this loyalty, this family he had built from the wreckage. Later that night, he and Lena stood on the cantilevered balcony of their home, the one he had designed to feel as if it were floating among the stars. The city spread out below them, a glittering tapestry of light and life. The air was cool and clean. Lena leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "You're quiet," she said softly. "Just thinking," he said, "about foundations." "They seem pretty solid from up here," she murmured, her hand finding his. He intertwined his fingers with hers, her skin warm and familiar against his. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless possibilities of the night sky, at the future stretching out before them. The ghost was gone. The war was over. The long, grueling work of the past 7 years had led him to this perfect, peaceful moment. He had lost everything, and in doing so, he had gained a world. He squeezed her hand gently. "We have work to do tomorrow,"